The young widow arrived at the ranch house with trembling hands, clutching the handle of her worn satchel. The sun was dipping low behind the rolling fields, casting long shadows across the land that seemed both welcoming and intimidating. She had taken the job out of necessity, her savings nearly gone, her small home too quiet since her husband's passing. The rancher, a man known for his wealth and stern demeanor, had asked her to cook for him and his daughter. As she stepped inside the grand house, she felt her breath catch, the polished wooden floors, the heavy drapes, the silence that pressed against her ears. She wasn't sure where she belonged in such a place, but she reminded herself she had come here to work, to stand on her own 2 feet, and to somehow rebuild the pieces of her life. In the kitchen, she found her rhythm, chopping vegetables with a steadiness that came from years of making meals for a family that no longer gathered around her table. The aromas of simmering stew began to fill the air, and for the first time that day, she felt useful again. Yet as she carried the dishes to the dining room, her heart pounded, uncertain of how the rancher would receive her efforts. He sat tall and quiet at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. His little daughter sat beside him, thin shoulders drawn in, eyes downcast as though she carried a loneliness far too heavy for her age. The widow noticed the untouched food on the child's plate and felt a pang in her chest. She set down the serving spoon, walked quietly to the girl's side, and offered a gentle smile. It was then the silence broke, not with words, but with the smallest, unexpected giggle. At the table, the widow felt the weight of the silence more than the clinking of forks. The rancher ate slowly, his gaze steady but distant, as though his mind was miles away in the fields. The little girl, though, barely touched her food. She pushed peas across her plate, lifted her fork only to set it down again, her small shoulders hunched in a way that spoke louder than words. The widow hesitated, unsure if it was her place to interfere. She had been hired to cook, nothing more. Yet something inside her, some instinct that came from years of mothering and from the aching absence of her own child, urged her to move. Quietly, she knelt beside the girl, lowering herself so their eyes could meet. "You don't like stew?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a warmth she hadn't planned. The child blinked, startled at first, and then a shy smile crept across her lips. She shook her head, but the smile grew when the widow tapped the edge of the bowl with a playful look. "Just one bite," she coaxed gently. The girl giggled, a sound so light and unexpected that even the rancher paused mid-bite. It was the first ripple of laughter that had stirred the heavy air of that house in far too long. For a fleeting second, the widow felt her chest tighten with a mixture of sorrow and hope, as if the laughter belonged to her own lost child. She returned to her place quietly, but the sound of that giggle stayed with her, echoing through the house long after the dishes were cleared, hinting that perhaps her role here was meant to be more than just serving meals. When the plates were cleared and the lamps dimmed low, the widow gathered her things, ready to retreat to her small quarters. But before she could slip away, a gentle tug at her sleeve stopped her. The rancher's daughter stood there in her nightdress, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, her eyes wide with a mixture of hesitation and longing. "Can she tuck me in too?" the little girl asked, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. The widow froze, her breath catching in her chest. She glanced at the rancher, uncertain if she had overstepped her bounds by even earning such a request. His jaw tightened, his brow furrowed, but instead of the expected refusal, he gave a slow nod. The widow followed the girl up the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last, her heart drumming with both fear and tenderness. In the quiet of the bedroom, she pulled the covers snug around the child and smoothed back her hair with a mother's touch she thought she had lost forever. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she began to hum an old lullaby, one that had once filled her own home when her child was small, before illness had stolen him away. The melody trembled at first, but as the girl's eyelids grew heavy, it steadied, wrapping the room in a soft cocoon of comfort. The widow's throat tightened with tears she would not allow to fall. When the child's breathing slowed into sleep, a fragile peace settled in the room. For the first time since her husband's passing, the widow felt her love had somewhere to go. She lingered for a moment, watching the little girl clutch her rabbit, and realized this house was no longer as cold as it had seemed when she first arrived. The days that followed carried a quiet transformation through the ranch house. Where silence once lingered, laughter began to slip between the walls, carried on the voice of a little girl rediscovering joy. The widow rose early each morning, filling the kitchen with the smell of warm bread and simmering soups, her hands steady with purpose. She noticed how the girl lingered by her side more often, asking to stir the pot or knead the dough, her cheeks flushed with delight. At mealtimes, the rancher still sat tall and reserved at the head of the table, but something in him had shifted. He stayed longer after the plates were cleared, listening instead of withdrawing, watching his daughter chatter in ways she hadn't in months. More than once, his gaze wandered to the widow, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes that words never quite captured. The widow, for her part, felt the ache of her own loss ease just a little each day. It wasn't gone, grief never truly left, but it softened in the warmth of this unexpected companionship. She caught herself humming again while she worked, a sound she hadn't realized had disappeared from her life. Even the house itself seemed to breathe differently, lamps glowed brighter, windows opened wider, and the heavy air that once pressed against its walls now felt lighter. The widow hadn't meant to bring change, she had come simply to cook, to find work and survive. Yet she was offering something far deeper, something she hadn't known she still carried. She was feeding more than bodies, she was feeding the hunger for connection, for comfort, for love. And in return, she, too, was being nourished by the laughter of a child and the softened heart of a man who had thought himself beyond hope. One evening, after a long day on the ranch, the widow carried a tray of tea down the hall and paused at the doorway to the little girl's room. Inside, the child was fast asleep, her small hand curled trustingly around the widow's fingers. The sight rooted her to the floor, such simple closeness, yet it carried the weight of everything she had thought she had lost forever. She looked up to see the rancher standing in the doorway, his usual stern expression softened into something unguarded. For a moment, he said nothing, only took in the scene before him, his daughter, no longer lonely, and the woman who had gently stitched joy back into their lives with nothing more than kindness. When his eyes finally met the widow's, they were filled not with command but with gratitude, deep and wordless. She felt her throat tighten, realizing this home that once seemed so foreign had become a place where she belonged, not because of duty, but because of love that had quietly grown in the spaces between meals, laughter, and lullabies. As she gently laid the child's hand upon her pillow and rose from the bedside, a warmth settled over her that she hadn't known since before loss had hollowed her heart. In that quiet moment, all three lives had been altered. The rancher had regained not just laughter in his home, but hope. His daughter had found comfort and the tender presence she longed for. And the widow, once broken and drifting, discovered that love, given freely and received without asking, had the power to rebuild. Sometimes family is not the one you expect, but the one you create together, through simple acts of care that turn a house back into a home.